many years, there's a way that I begin every talk. I begin by saying today's Hebrew date. And for me, this is important, but as we know, today's date is unique. It never was and never will be again, which of course means that today is unique and today will never come back. And that thought itself is often enough for me to realize that let this day really count. After saying today's date in Hebrew, I add a pasuk, a verse from Tehillim that talks about joy, about simcha, because we know so much of life is not just what happens to you, but what our vantage point is on life. So, without further ado, Hayom Yudalid Iyar Tafshin Pei Ze Hayom Asa Adonai Nagila V'nismecha Bo. Now today's talk is based on a recent book which is out in Hebrew, which the title in English would be Life as Story, Seeing the World with New Eyes. And I think the book's conception began at a night when I was in Dharamsala in India. And it was a long night. I was telling stories. And we had people from all the 6 continents of the world represented, Jews, non-Jews. And deep into the night, somebody, in responding to many of the stories that I had shared with them, told me, quoted the author Paul Auster, that Paul Auster said, stories happen to people that tell stories. And this insight, it's so true. And I'd like to begin by talking about why is it that stories happen to people who tell stories. And again, for those who it's appropriate, if you open your videos, because it's such a joy to be able to see everybody here. So getting back to stories happen to people who tell stories. There's a famous saying by the French author, Marcel Proust. There's some sort of an echo here. Okay, I'm going to try to solve this. Okay, so hopefully the echo will not continue with us. Marcel Proust said, the challenge of life is not in discovering new lands, but in seeing the old lands with new eyes. Okay, it's an important quote, so we're going to say it again. The challenge of life is not in discovering new lands, but in seeing the old ones with new eyes. And a person who tells stories looks at life differently. He looks at life with different eyes. He sees life itself as a story. Now, when you look at life as a story, 2 things happen. First of all, if this is a story, you ask yourself, what is my part in this story? What role do I have in this story? And that question can empower us to action, to play our part than had we not had that insight. Second of all, if we look at life as a story, we're able to learn from life, learn life's lessons, because stories have meaning and significance. And so looking at life as a book, a text, a story, and then always asking, what is this teaching us? In the most ancient Kabbalistic work, Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, says that God created the world with story, that the world itself is a manifestation of a great story. And in fact, I once had a friend who asked me if I could really put my finger on what makes us the Jewish people, what makes us the way we are. Because in many ways, we look so different. Even looking now, together with us, we have Jews from, we have people from Israel, from Europe, South America, and America. And we look so often so different from one another. But if there's one thing that connects us, in a word, I would say in Hebrew, hasipur, the story. There's a story that connects all of us together. So that aspect of a story is it's something very fundamental to our identity. Or as Rabbi Yonatan Sachs, the former Prime Minister of England, has said, a former Chief Rabbi of England, sorry about that, Chief Rabbi of England has said that the Jewish people are not a people that have a story, but rather a story that has a people. Now, what does it mean to look at life as a story? We know that children often have these books that have pages that are about connecting the dots. Connecting the dots, you open up a workbook and there are a lot of little dots and you have to connect them. And when you connect the dots, a picture emerges. This is a tremendous parable about life, about each of our days. During each of our days of our lives, many things happen. All the events that are happening during the day or during our lives, they're like separate points. They could be disconnected, but our vantage point on these different dots is what really connects them and creates the story. Now, in those children's workbooks, there's only one way to connect the little dots. In the story of our lives, the many little points and events, our vantage point, there's so many different ways we could connect these dots together and create the story. Wow, it's such a great seeing so many friends I see and neighbors here. Now, thank you, Gershon. Now, relating to stories and this deep truth that we each have our story, I'd like to share with you something that I heard from a student of mine. I had a student called Jason, and he came to Israel eventually, but for 2 years, he was in Montana, out west in America, and he worked as a volunteer for people who were sick that were terminally ill, people that knew that they had their days were very limited. And Jason would go to them and say, please tell me, what is the story of your life? And he said that people would usually answer, I don't have any story. Nothing happened in my life. But he wouldn't give up. He'd keep saying, please, what is your story? And ultimately, they would start talking, but then like a dam bursting, once some memories would come back, more and more memories would come out. And suddenly they would realize, often for the first time, how to connect the dots. And these people at the end of their lives would discover, yes, they had a story to their lives,
Well,
and their story was meaningful. And my student Jason, he would tape, he would record these discussions, and the same night he would go and type it all up and print out a number of copies. There's, of course, only a very short amount of time because these are people who are terminally ill. But within a few days, he was able to put out a booklet with a number of copies and bring it to the person and say, here, this is your story as you told me, for you and for your family. So we all have a story, and we don't have to wait till the end to look back and think about the story. The challenge is now with new eyes, seeing our days, seeing our lives, and discovering what is my story. And by discovering that, you learn more, what's the next step? How do I develop this story and what it means? I'd like to make some other points about stories. Sometimes people look at stories as some way of entertainment during the interludes, that you want to be serious, talk ideology or philosophy, if you want to really talk about life. And if you need a break, so let's hear a story. But I think the opposite really is true. I think philosophy, for example, touches on only a small dimension of life itself. Stories are life itself. Story includes the meanings, it includes the philosophy, but it's so much more vibrant and expansive than that narrowness of philosophy. And as we know, it's so much more valuable and deep things that are learned from life than things that are learned just from books. I have a story of a young widow of one of my students. When she got remarried, but she once told me that she went on a date with somebody and she wanted to share some of the deepest truths that she learned from her story about, despite everything she's went through, she feels that God is with her. But the student at some yeshiva who listens to her, she said, she looked at me like I'm just saying these trivial things. I mean, of course, everybody knows, all the books say that even if your husband gets killed, God is with you. So he wasn't impressed by her deepest statements, mistaking if it says so in a book, that means you know it already, and not realizing that what emerges from life, these are really the great teachings. And maybe one other little anecdote, and then I'll try to get to some beyond this introduction. There's an ancient Hasidic story that a person whose father had passed away, he got recurring dreams of his father being on a cross. He was very disturbed. He went to the Hasidic master, and the master said that perhaps what happened was, in those times, the grave diggers were often the local non-Jews, and perhaps this gravedigger thought, in order to help your father, put a cross into the grave. They opened the grave, and sure enough, that's what had happened. They said the story made it back to the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was known as a great opponent of the Hasidim and a great Talmudic scholar. And when he heard the story, he said, I'm not so impressed, because that this is the solution to the dream, this is obvious because we could deduce it from this very certain passage in the Talmud. What impresses me is that Hasidic master knows that part of the Talmud. But the story got back to the Hasidic master, and he said, the truth is, I didn't know that passage in the Talmud, but I knew it from the same place that the Talmud knew it. So to learn from life is to learn it from the same place that all those books learned it from. Okay, now, okay, and please people look also at the chats because people are adding very nice comments here from Kierkegaard, Viktor Frankl, many great luminaries are mentioned. Now, okay, I'd like to go on to a story which for me has been very significant. It's a story that starts from a very sad place, but ultimately it leads to places of understanding what joy and simcha are all about. And this story goes back to a student of mine almost 20 years ago. It's called Avi Sabag, who was killed in a terrorist attack when he was 24. Now, one of the most devastating feelings after that terror attack was that how hard it is, the realization it's so hard to build a life, but it's so easy to destroy things. They say that's why they break a cup at a Jewish wedding, to remind us, the young couple, it's so hard to build. It's so easy to destroy. And I felt it's so disproportionate that to build up someone's life, it means that how much the parents invest, how much the teachers invest, and most of all, how much the person himself or herself works on themselves to build themselves. And it's so disproportionate that so easily this could all be destroyed. But then suddenly, well, in this deep feelings of painful feelings, suddenly I had a moment of revelation, realizing that there's another way to look at life. If life is all about a series of stages, each stage preparing the next stage, then you might feel that you didn't get where you're supposed to get to. And all these preparations did not achieve the fruit that they were designed for. But there's another way to look at life. We could look at life that every part, every day is a world in its own. And this vantage point to say that today is a fulfillment in itself. It is a world in itself. That means that every day can be a fulfillment and achievement that nothing could take it from you. So as in the eulogy that I gave to that student, I said he had few years, but many days filled with joy of doing good things, and thousands of very many blessed days. Okay, so this is, and when I had that insight, I realized that this is something very significant. This is something that could and should be a life changer. But I realized that so often we come to insights but as times go by and the insights dull, and ultimately we are left empty, they are only a memory of the past. And I realized I don't want to forget this insight. It's too important to forget. But then the next day, I discovered the way that this insight can every day guide me. I woke up in the morning, and when we wake up in the morning, the first thing we do while we're still in bed is we say the words of the Modeh Ani. It's 12 words in Hebrew. I'll say it in Hebrew and then translate. Modeh Ani lefanecha, melech chai vekayam, shechazarta bi nishmati bechemla, rabba emunotecha. We thank God for returning to us our neshama, our soul. Now, when in the morning we thank God for returning our soul, the thanks we give, we're thanking him for today, because tomorrow, again, we will say thank you. So we wake up in the morning, we have received the blessing of life again. For how long have we received this blessing? We have received this blessing for today. And realizing that today is a value in itself helps us focus on some of the big questions in life. The big question in life is, how do I want today to look? We could spend so much. It is important to plan more distant future, but so often our thoughts are not focused, thinking general about different issues or problems. Better to have a set time to do long-term planning, but today to focus on, how do I want today to look? What do I want to, yes, be part of today? What do I want not to be part of today? And thinking about this, these are thoughts that could help transform today and make it the way that it should be. Relating to the Modeh Ani, let me just mention, I once told this over to a student of mine, and he shared with me what his thoughts are about that prayer of Modeh Ani. That student's name was Yaakov, and he married a girl called Hadar. And in Aramaic, Hadar means return. So under the chuppah, because I was the rabbi who did the wedding, I talk about the wedding is of returning to be together based on a view of this oneness of soul that predates the birth of the couple. And a few days later, he told me that he wakes up in the morning and he begins saying the Modeh Ani, saying, Modeh Ani, thank you for returning my neshama. And then he says, wait, I just remembered, I just got married, and I'm married to Hadar, and Hadar means return, and she's my neshama. So he says, I look at my wife and I say, thank you, God, for returning to me my neshama. Okay, so everybody could everyone has their Modeh Ani, and you're all invited to come up with your meanings and interpretations of that short and beautiful prayer, which helps us get up on the right side of the bed. Okay, now this insight ultimately evolved in, wow, I certainly have to, I'd love to acknowledge all the people here, but it's such a joy also to see my very, very dear brother, who is also joining us here. Now, if you recall, or those of us who began at the beginning of today's talk, we began by saying the pasuk, Ze hayom asa Hashem nagila v'nismecha bo. This is the day that God has made. Let us be filled with joy. 1 second. Someone's making a comment, please. Please again. I didn't fully hear the comment. Okay, so I think there was a comment. I like to now. That start of every shiur is obviously a development of that insight. The insight relating to Avi Sabag, that every day is a world in itself, is a value in itself, leads us to the next step of, so how do I want today to look? And one day I was saying the prayer of Hallel together with the Yeshiva in Otniel, and I got to that verse from Tehillim, Ze hayom asa Hashem nagila v'nismecha bo. And I thought, what day is this talking about? And suddenly it hit me. This is the day that God has made. Let us fill it with joy. It's talking about today. And by talking about, and what that means, and what does it mean that on each day to say, this is the day that God has made, let us be filled with joy, is saying that the joy in life doesn't come from this or that happens. That the joy in life is about the vantage point, the way we open our eyes and see life as as a blessing. This allows us to find our joy in life. So just like the Mishnah says about Pirkei Avot, that love that is dependent on something is something that is love that will not last. In the same way, joy that is dependent on certain factors is something that won't last. The joy we're looking for is a way of looking at life differently. And I'd like to tell some anecdotes that could try to explain this, what this means. There's a movie called In America. It was a pretty small movie. Probably most people haven't seen it. It's about a family that has a tragedy in the family. And they move from Ireland to New York to get away from these bad memories. Now they're living in a slum in Harlem, and they have this big, scary-looking neighbor that they're all scared of. And one day the neighbor goes to the father of that family and says, I wish I was in your place. And the father gets really nervous. He says, what? Are you in love with my wife or something? And the person says, I'm in love with you. I'm in love with your wife. I'm in love with your children. I'm in love with your anger. And when he says that incredible statement, I'm in love with your anger, the father realizes, he says, oh, are you dying? And it turns out that indeed, that intimidating looking neighbor has AIDS. And in the movie, as he leaves life, he teaches the family to come back into life. Because it's a question of perspective. When we step out of the little things and look from above, we could often see things differently. Or I have a friend, Kazowicz, he's a doctor now living in Neve Daniel, but he tells me a story of two of his patients from when he still lived in America. One of them was this well-to-do person who would come with this long, sad face, And my friend Danny Kazowitz would ask him, what happened? And it would always be connected to something that happened a long, long time ago. On the other hand, there was a poor black woman in a wheelchair who would come she lived all alone in poverty, and she'd come with this beautiful smile on her face. And Dr. Kazowitz once asked her, how do you do it? Where do you find the strength to smile? So first she tried to avoid the question and say, well, I see you, it's so wonderful to see you. But he said, no, I really want to understand. Where is this coming from? So this woman said that when she was in the traffic accident, that the doctor said that she would never walk again. And she said, I looked in the mirror and I thought to myself, nobody wants to see an old black lady in a wheelchair. So I put a smile on my face and I haven't taken it down since. By losing everything except for life, she realized she had to accept life as it is and found her way even to simchat chayim, to the joy of life. Now, this whole, okay, now I see a comment from my very dear friends Gershon and Gila. Simcha or ashrei, unconditioned or conditional, it's about Sukkot or not. Okay, so really Sukkot is the time of Simcha. But feel free also to talk. I'd love everyone to hear your voices. So open up. Okay, so Gershon and Gila, our holy friends from Holland. Now, Neil, please.
Yeah, Ya'akov, if you talk about the prayer in the morning and you live by the day, in its day self, it's all about Simcha though.
Yeah.
It's not, that's what we're discussing about in your fabulous speech so far. It's not about Esrei, it's not about conditional, but unconditional, to feel the joy in the moment. I think that's one of the greatest gifts Hashem can give us. Yeah. You agree, or?
I'm with you, Gershon. Wow. Okay. Okay. So everyone's invited to move to Otniel. Gershon and Gila came from Holland, moved to Otniel recently, and it's really a joy to have them here. Okay. Now this whole approach, I think we could root it in the story of the Garden of Eden. We know that in the Garden of Eden, the sin was eating from the tree of knowledge, of dat. Now, and the punishment was, with the sweat of your brow, you will eat bread. Now, somehow, that punishment, it's not clear exactly is that really a punishment. When growing up in Manhattan and thinking about one day moving to Israel, I always imagined all the Israelis with those funny hats on, singing away as they're plowing the fields and working the land. This could be part of the dream of connecting to the land of Israel. So why is this a curse? And in fact, in 2005, when they evicted all the Jews from Gush Katif, one of the settlements was the town of Kfar Darom, which was an agricultural settlement. And all of Kfar Darom, after they forcefully took them out, they brought them to a hotel in Beersheba, which was ironically called the Paradise Hotel. And in the Paradise Hotel, 3 meals a day, room service, an elevator. But the people seemed pretty sad about the fact that they weren't working the land. So sweating while you're working the land is it a curse or is it a blessing? What I realize is this is really the message of the Garden of Eden. There were two trees in the Garden of Eden. The tree of knowledge, which is, I think, a little bit of a mistranslation, because in Hebrew it's the Eitz Hadat. Now, dat could also be consciousness. The tree of consciousness of good and evil, the good and the bad. And I think that eating from a tree that your consciousness divides life up into the good parts and to the bad parts will lead you to say, okay, so life has to get split up. There's the good parts is eating the bread. The other parts are sweating away to work for it. But there was another possibility. If in the Garden of Eden, there was also the tree of life, Eitz HaChaim. And if we had connected, instead of a tree of consciousness of good and bad, to the tree of life, we would see life itself as a great blessing. And with life as a great blessing, we would find our joy, both in eating the bread and also in sweating away in the field. Let me just mention that even though with this teaching, really every day we could say upon it, Zeh hayom asa Hashem nagila v'nismacha bo. In the complexities of reality, we know that often there are days that tragic things happen, sad things happen, and it would be insensitive to focus on joy when there's great pain on that day. So, but here too, I find my practice of beginning every class with that verse helps me connect up also to those days where mourning is appropriate. Because since I usually say the entire pasuk, I say the first half only on days of mourning. I will say, Zeh hayom asa Hashem, this is the day God has made, and I will suddenly stop myself and not add on those extra words of the joy. Or I know that many of you from Argentina know, of course, that lovely couple, David and Sarah, and yesterday's Sarah's grandfather was one of the greatest rabbis in Israel of our generation, Rabbi Nachum Rabinovitz. He's also the teacher of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He passed away. So on that day in our yeshiva, they canceled all the classes in the afternoon to give respect to Rav Rabinovitz and allow people to listen to the eulogies. So on that day, I gave my class and said only Zeh hayom asa Hashem and held back. So I feel this practice allows us to give us a way to connect up to those days of mourning. So where do we try to make the difference? Some days are exceptionally joyful in their own right. Some days are days of mourning. What really matters is everything in between. What direction are we going to pull them? Will we pull them to the eyes of joy or the eyes of some type of banality? One of our very dear staff members, Rabbi Menachem Fruman of blessed memory, I even have a picture of him here. This is the very, very, very holy Rabbi Menachem Fruman. One story that at his yeshiva, his wife told me, is that there was a yeshiva that he was part of. And one day he comes into the yeshiva and he seems he was very smiley and happy. And people came over and said, what happened? What happened? So that kind of annoyed him. So the next day he decided he's going to come into the yeshiva, sit in a corner and say, oi, oi, oi. And nobody came in and said what happened. So the question, what's your default value? Is it joy until proven otherwise? Or is it oi until proven otherwise? Okay? So maybe I'll try to share with you one more story on a lighter vein, and then we'll all go do whatever we do. And a little bit about how really it's the vantage point that creates the story. For the following story I want to tell, nothing really happened. But I feel that the eyes on the story is what created for me the experience. This is going back to 2006, and I'm in Dharamsala, India. And for a while, I'm at what's called the Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish house, which tries to teach Judaism, in particular for the many Israelis, or mostly secular, who come to India after the army. And how do I find who the Israelis are? So there are these special sandals that only Israelis wear. So I'd go to the marketplace, and I'm looking at the sandals till I track down the Israelis. And one day I find somebody, he's called Shai, and I say, I had this class tonight. I would love for you to come. And I tell him all about it. And he says, wow, it sounds very interesting, but there's no chance I'm gonna come. And I say, why not? And he looks at me like I just came from the moon. He says, tonight's the Mondial. The Mondial. And the truth is, I still didn't know what the Mondial was then. I grew up in America. The Mondial is the world, and we have Argentina here, right? All the people here from Argentina all know what the Mondial is. And so I said, okay, so I guess no one's gonna show up. But to my great surprise, Shai shows up. But I'm feeling terrible. I'm saying, wow, because of me, he's gonna miss the Mondial. But then there was a miracle. There was a power shortage in Dharamsala. Nobody saw the Mondial in Dharamsala. So I said, thank you, God. It's not on my conscience that Shai didn't see the Mondial. Okay, now the following Shabbat, we're eating the Suda Shlishit, the meal at the end of Shabbat, and I see that there are exactly a minyan of people, 10 men for a minyan. So I say, hey, this is great. We could daven with a minyan. But then that same Shai says, no, you got a problem. I say, what's the problem? He says, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. You can't count me for a minyan. And then I realized that within a minute, people are going to start leaving and no minyan. So I have 1 minute to convince Shai to reconsider his atheism and help us with the minyan. So, Shai, so then I had inspiration that the previous Shabbat at the Bayit Yehudi, they eat the meals on the roof. Now, when it rains, and it rains a lot in Dharamsala, we take all the mattresses from the roof that people sit on, throw them down, and put them into the house. But the famous saying, look before you throw a mattress, I forgot, and I threw the mattress, and it fell on the head of Hadara, who was this girl from Jerusalem, who was single, but she put on a covering to her hair because she didn't want all the guys to leave her alone, and it knocked off her hair covering. So I was very apologetic, but what could you do? But the following Shabbat, I was standing below and she was above. And at the end of the Shabbos meal, there was this pot that had a little bit of the chamin, of the chont left. And she was washing it. And then she poured out that dirty water from the roof and it fell right on my head. And I said, look, Shai, there's justice in the world. He heard that, and there was a minyan. Now, I didn't quite figure out what was it that convinced him. But the next day, I had another story that helped me understand the dynamics of persuasion. I'm sitting somewhere, and someone comes over and starts talking. He had just come back from Osho's ashram. Now, Osho, for those who don't know, was one of the most corrupt gurus of the 20th century. And this guy could only talk how wonderful Osho's and his teachings are. So I try to tell him the hard truth, how corrupt Osho is. Everybody knows all the scandals with money, with women, with this and with that, but nothing is getting through. But then my Zen meditation teacher shows up, Yaron Cohen, and he says, what? You're talking about Osho? He goes, Osho, he's not serious. He wrote a book about Zazen. Zazen is Zen meditation, even though that he himself never practices Zen meditation. Now, in my humble opinion, this was a very weak argument, because if it's a good book, first of all, could I care if he doesn't do Zen meditation? And second of all, how do you know he doesn't do Zen meditation? Maybe he does it in his free time and doesn't tell people about it. But to my surprise, the person I'm talking to is very impressed and moved by these arguments. So I realized that in discussion, what really counts is not something objectively how convincing or not convincing something is. If you say over the old arguments again and again, even if they're pretty convincing, it's not going to help. People's ears are closed. But if you talk from something from deep into your heart, something unexpected, this is the way to open people's hearts. Okay, so I begin every shiur by that pasuk that talks about simcha, joy. But life really can and should be balanced. So I end every shiur with the last verse of the book of Kohelet that talks about, not about the joy, but about the awe and the fear. Okay, or Gila, the second to last verse. And talks not about the being, but about the doing. So let me end with that verse. Sof davar, hakol nishma, et ha'elohim yira, ve'et mitzvotav shmor, ki ze kol ha'adam,